You've got a basic small block Chevy 350. What would you rather add? Bolt-ons or boost? What the heck? Let's try both. Hello everybody, I'm Richard Holdner, and as always, welcome to the channel. But where are my small block Chevy guys? Let's say you have a stock small block Chevy and you're thinking, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to make over 400 horsepower. Who wants to use bolt-ons? You know, heads, cam, and intake. What about boost? Take your stock small block Chevy, add boost, boom, over 400 horsepower. And I know what you should be thinking right about now, Richard. Heads, cam, intake, you know, bolt-ons, boost. Why can't we combine the two? Well, you know how we do it here. I'm going to give you one, I'm going to give you the other, and then I'm going to give you both. So let's check it out. Okay, guys, let's jump right in and take a look at our small block Chevy modifications. We are going to compare bolt-ons versus boost, and obviously at the end we got to combine all of them because that's obviously going to be the best. But we started off with a GM 190 horsepower crate motor, their Target Master, if you will. Basically kind of the bottom of the barrel for this is just your basic run-of-the-mill small block Chevy. And it just barely qualifies as that. But it actually did fairly well in terms of power. And we've run this kind of motor through the decades, basically, because this thing has been available forever. So this was a GM 190 horse crate motor, which means it had like 8.5 to 1 compression. It had the smallest camshaft possible, sub 190 degree at 50, sub 450 lift. And it was designed to be a replacement like truck engine, basically. It had smog heads on it, 76 cc chambers, 194 intake valve, 150 exhaust valves. Again, low compression, mild cam. And in this case, the cylinder heads were actually not limiting power output because we had such, mild camshaft in it. And what we did because this thing comes as a long block, we had to finish it up. And the way that we configured this, the way that most people do, what we did was put a 4-barrel intake manifold on it, 4-barrel carburetor, headers, distributor, and finish it up so that it could be run on the dyno. So we ran this thing with a GM dual plane intake manifold, a Holley 650 XP carburetor. It was the one sitting in the in the cabinet at Westex, so we just grabbed that. We ran this with dyno headers, makes it easy to get everything in MSC distributor. The dyno headers look kind of like sprint cars. Like I said, we did those because it's easy. They work well with either straight plug or angle plug heads, and we can run the distributor wiring underneath the distributor. It makes easy access stuff, basically, more than anything else. They're just more for convenience. This thing ran best with about 35 degrees of total timing, and then run on the engine dyno. We didn't really even have to do much jetting in terms of the 650 carburetor. It was really nice right out of the cabinet. This thing produced, their 190 horsepower combination, produced 263 horsepower. So see, you get more than you pay for. And torque was up in the 350 foot-pound range. So good torque. And actually, we should have run this thing down lower because this thing made peak power at 4,300 RPM and likely would have made peak torque in the 3,300 RPM range had we loaded this thing at 2,000, which looking back, we should have, to be fair to this combination, because it is a low RPM combination. But let's take a look now and see what happens when we modified this combination. But before that, let's take a look and see what happens because we added a VORTECH supercharger to this combination in basically bone stock trim. I don't think a lot of people would do that. They would take a base crate motor like this and add a supercharger to it. If you're going to add a supercharger, you probably would step up at least with a camshaft or something. But here's what happened when we added the VORTECH supercharger to it. This thing was run with a 6.5-inch crank pulley and a 3.6-inch blower pulley. It was a VORTECH V3, so I think it was an S trim, so it had more than enough power to support. I mean, we could support almost twice this amount of power, so it had more than enough to support this level. It was run with no intercooler. It was also run with a CSU 850 blow-through carburetor, and we ran it with a dual plane intake manifold, but we normally run a spacer between the carburetor and the intake manifold, not to gain power, but because it provides us access to vacuum reference lines so that we can measure boost and stuff. But run with the VORTECH, this thing was making actually about 10 pounds of boost. This thing made 421 horsepower, 420, and 460 foot-pounds of torque. This thing was actually making a lot more boost than we wanted it to, only because it was such a mild restrictive NA combination. But now let's take a look and see what happens when we step things up and modified our NA combo. Okay, we've got to take a look at what happens when we take the GM crate motor, put a carb and intake and distributor headers on it, run it, and then add a VORTECH supercharger. Now let's take a look and see what happens when we take the basic, crate motor and upgrade it and put the things on it that it really needs, meaning heads, cam, and intake, to get this thing to make even more power. So this is once again our GM crate motor with the 4-barrel 650, the GM dual plane, our dyno headers, and an MSD distributor, 263 horsepower, near 350 foot-pounds of torque. But here's what happened when we upgraded this thing. Go ahead and move myself out of the way here. First of all, you can see we made, well, you can see two things. First of all, we made a lot more power, and we also made it at a much higher RPM. In fact, peak power happened right at 5,900, 6,000, whereas before it was only at 4,400 RPM. In fact, now we are making peak torque, again, probably nearly another 1,000 RPM, 4,100 or so is where peak torque happened. But let's talk about the modifications that we made. But first off, let's get to our peak numbers. 413 horsepower and a little bit more torque, 415 foot-pounds of torque. So the combination did really well, but let's talk about that. First of all, we know we needed more head flow. We ditched the stock 194, 1.5, 76cc chamber, iron, stock GM, like smog heads, and replaced them with the arguably a really, really good set, maybe the best set for a small block Chevy, who knows. A set of Airflow Research 190, and these were competition heads, so that they had way more head flow than we could possibly take advantage of. They have enough head flow on those 190 comp heads, eliminator heads, to support 100 more horsepower, but we were only near, a little over 400. But we had those heads had also had some additional work done. They had been milled, so it brought the chambers down from 64 cc's down to 61 cc's. So in addition to making having a lot more flow to support more power, they also upped the static compression ratio quite a bit, from 8.5 to 1 to a little over 10 to 1 when you do all of the math. So we had lots of head flow. What we needed now was more camshaft. So we went from the mild stock camshaft to a hydraulic roller, and this was actually a retrofit hydraulic roller, but it was an XFI version. And when we chose that because it had quite a bit more lift than the other normal extreme energy versions. So this was a 576, 570 lift. This was a 230, 236 degree duration and 113 degree lobe separation angle, and was getting very, very close on piston to valve, despite the fact that the factory GM crate motor had 4 eyebrows in it. So we had our camshaft, we had our cylinder heads. What we needed now was an intake manifold. Quite honestly, the GM dual plane was pretty good, but we settled on an RPM air gap and an even larger carburetor. We didn't want to restrict it. The 650 probably could have worked here at this power range, but we went ahead and stepped up to a 750 carburetor. We kept our MSD distributor and kept the long tube headers on it, and that's what allowed us to make this kind of power. You'll remember that adding the VORTECH on it made over 400 horsepower. Adding boost to it, which was good to our stock motor. So you can get there either way, but really the question is now, okay, Richard, you've done the stock motor, you've done the stock motor with a blower, and now you've upgraded the stock motor to, the modified combination with heads, cam, and intake manifold. And now we have to have the combination of all of those, and let's take a look at that. So here's where we added our VORTECH supercharger to our GM crate motor, and we didn't rev it as high as we probably should have, but this is with a pulley combination that produced, started out at 2.1 pounds down there at 3,000 RPM and a peak of 7,000 or 7 PSI, and we were at 560 or so horsepower. 566 horsepower, and peak torque checked in at 521, but obviously we weren't done there. We did a pulley change like you always do to a VORTECH to push this thing up over 600 horsepower, 610 616 or 7, no, 612 horsepower. Peak torque jumped up to 558 foot-pounds of torque, and this pushed boost up to 8.7 pounds. Started out at 2.7 down there, down low, but rose to 8.7 pounds. So it did really well. This was non-intercooled. Again, we're breathing through the CSU blow-through carburetor with our spacer between the dual plane intake manifold. And all of this worked out really well. We did play with the carburetor a little bit. We adjusted both the jetting and adjusted the boost reference power valves, and all of that worked out very well. As you see, you can take a stock motor, you can add boost to it, you can modify your motor, or then combine all of them and add boost to the modified motor, and good things start to happen. Armature Holdener, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I'll keep testing.